ex-Lib Dem MP. So let's get his thoughts on the lot of it. Norman, great to have you on the programme. Hello.
All right.
Is this, on first reading, I'm there thinking, well, this is a madness. The Tory policy to say if you come into the country on a small boat, you've committed a crime, you're breaking in, you're not going to be given any right to stay. On the face of it, to me, seems very sensible. And yet, speaking to Matthew Larder, who's going to be joining us again in a moment, former Labour advisor, he says the downside to this policy, though, is that people are just disappearing. They're not being documented. They're being put up into hotels. These aren't detention centres. They're wandering about the place. No one knows who they are, where they are. There's no sensible returns policy. So we've just ended up in this maelstrom of chaos with more and more people coming over and no one getting processed. What do you think?
Well, it is chaos, undoubtedly, and the information in the newspapers today from Home Office officials demonstrates that civil servants regard it as chaos, not least of all, for example, because there's a computer system called Atlas, which cost us as taxpayers £71 million to install, and which civil servants can't get into properly. So that's the sort of chaos which there is in the Home Office. But look, on the question of people arriving in boats, I want to depersonalise this in a sense and take it away from politics. But the position is, when people arrive in the country, they should be judged on whether they are genuine refugees or whether they aren't. Are they actually fleeing genuinely from the threat of persecution and death, or are they here for economic reasons? And that is not related to how they arrive here. The illegal migration bill, the illegal refers to the bill, in my view, not to the immigration. So it's quite right, people should be assessed individually on their merits. That's what we've signed up to internationally.
I mean, on that topic, if you are coming over the channel, you're not fleeing persecution. You're not a political exile from France. You're not going to be treated badly by the French state, one assumes. You're not sort of, escaping Emmanuel Macron's dastardly regime. You've had an opportunity to claim asylum. You've chosen not to. You're not claiming asylum at the first safe port. Yeah. You're saying, I want to live in the UK and I'm going to break into the country.
Well, that's perfectly true, Alex. And of course, it's been more difficult by Brexit, which means the arrangements that we had before with the Irish and with the French in particular have waned because they're no longer in force because of Brexit. That's been broken.
Well, I'm just going to interrupt here because, I love the topic of Brexit. You know me. The fact of the matter is, under the Dublin Agreement of which you speak, we barely returned anybody anyway. It didn't work. And if we wanted to play returns agreements with the EU, as they seem to now want us to play when it comes to migrants crossing over from Northern Ireland into the Republic of Ireland, we've got to sign up to whatever they decide, the slice of cake of the illegal migrants share that we have to take. So, you can understand why there's a bit of hesitancy in entering into negotiations with Europe on this.
Well, I mean, look, I'm not going to say that you have been perfect. That certainly hasn't been. It's perfectly true that people should be claiming asylum in the first port of entry, which is safe. That's perfectly true. But the fact of the matter is, if someone arrives here from a war zone, from Afghanistan or Iraq or somewhere, where the country is completely unstable and where they're likely to be killed because of their religion or some other reason, then we have a duty as a country to examine that person's case as they arrive on our doorstep. We should, of course, be taking steps to make sure that people claim asylum earlier in the process. But if they don't do that, we can argue that with the French, we have to treat them as individuals and assess them properly. And therefore, to say that you cannot be assessed properly because you've arrived in a boat, but you can be assessed properly if you arrive in an airplane, is nonsensical.
I can see your argument there. I want to delve into, you talked about this Atlas computer system. First thing I've heard of it, 71 million quid you say it's cost us, and they can't even access it. What's going on there? Tell us more about that. That sort of whets my appetite.
The history of this country, I'm afraid, under all governments, has been a litany of terrible investments in upturn technology, which turns out, look at the post office, for example, which turned out to be hopelessly useless and very expensive. And it's the same thing here. Civil servants are actually locked out of that computer system in some regards, which means you can't find addresses of people they're trying to track down. I mean, this is just a joke.
It's an absolute madness. Now, everyone's talking about speeding up the nature of processing people, which does make sense to me. But why is this not going at full pelt? Why have we not recruited thousands of more officials to look at people's applications and say, right, this is it, decision in 6 months, you're going home? I mean, they face all sorts of difficulties when it comes to, I think, things like identifying these people. People know to chuck passports in the sea and say they're from a country which perhaps they're not. And also very often, you're having to take people's word on things, aren't you? If someone says, well, look, I've come from, I used the example of Cameroon before, which in all intents and purposes isn't an unsafe country necessarily, but if you're on the wrong side of the head of state there, then you might be in a bit of difficulty. Yeah. But if old, whatever, comes over from Cameroon and says, I'm a political exile, it's very hard to prove he's not telling the truth. So how do you speed up the applications process?
Well, there's two things there, Alex. The first thing is there are countries where, if, for example, you're gay, the rest of the country might be safe, but if you're gay, you can be executed when you get back to that country. So, but it's very difficult to prove that you're gay or not gay in that situation. So it's a very difficult case for the civil servants and the officials to work out. But on the more general point, it's disgraceful, in my view, that the processing of applications takes so long. And I've argued for a long time, including when I was in government, this should be speeded up, because people who are genuine refugees should be accepted into the country and assimilated where they can start paying taxes and working rather than being a drain on the state. And if they're not genuine, they can be sent back somewhere. That's what should be happening. But instead, there's thousands upon thousands in limbo, going nowhere, costing the taxpayer money, a great distress to the individuals concerned who may well be genuine refugees. And it's a disgrace on the government they haven't sorted this out.
Stay with us, Norman. I'm pleased to say that Matthew Larser has crawled on his hands and knees, scuttled across the floor like a creature to join me again in the studio after thinking he had enough time in the advert break to nip off.
I know.
Turns out he didn't.
It's schoolboy error.
But, I want to really focus in. I mean, it's interesting. Norman brought up something we spoke about early on in this show, which is people who come from countries where homosexuality is persecuted. The problem is, if you look at the statistics on this, that is a great number of countries in the world, a very great number of countries in the world. Extremely sadly, without a doubt. And also, as Norman was saying, very difficult to prove someone's sexuality. Yeah. And also we were talking earlier, of course, again about religion and people converting to Christianity. I'm a Christian. I like anybody who wants to join the club. That's what Jesus would have wanted. And yet you kind of think that, well, when this is being done in order to claim asylum in a country and it's not genuine, something needs to be done about that. So how do you speed up this processing? How do you do it? No one seems to have the answer to that.
You have to introduce presumptions into the system. So if you are fleeing persecution because of your sexuality, then presumably you don't need to. It would be a good idea, if it was genuine, not to throw away your passport, not to throw away your documents, and to bring some evidence with you. Of previous relationships or whatever. So you certainly think you wouldn't go into the presumption is that if you are going to be claiming asylum on the basis of effectively what you might call a protected characteristic, be that of your political opponent or your sexuality in the country that you're fleeing from, then you think you would bring some evidence for that. If you arrive with nothing, with no evidence whatsoever, and without your passport, so you can't even tell what country you are. Remember, of course, it's not just saying what country you come from. There's a big issue about telling what age people are. I have a friend who's a social worker and says that it's with sort of teenagers who get wrapped up in the asylum system, and then they end up, if they're classed as adults, they end up shoved at 14 into hotels with a lot of adults, some of whom she says are up to no good, as we can imagine. She's not on the right politically, but she's realistic about what her clients, the people she works with, face. So I think we need some presumptions in the system rather than the onus in a sense has to be on the migrant rather than has to be on the Home Office to at least produce something. I'm not saying that you can, it's obviously those are delicate situations, but if you're throwing everything into the English Channel, I'm not saying where you've come from, how can we tell if you're being persecuted?
Yeah, bring your photo album and a rainbow flag and get a crucifix tattooed on your arm. Norman, I want to direct your attention now to this big spat that's erupted between Rishi Sunak and the Taoiseach of Northern Ireland over the 80%, they say, of people claiming asylum, Republic of Ireland, claiming asylum in down there in Dublin. 80%, they say, have crossed the border from Northern Ireland, and a few people have gone out and done some vox pops, and they said, we don't want to be sent to Rwanda, therefore we're going to go back into the EU, which in a way I kind of have a wry smile and think, well, yeah, that's from whence you came. And now there's news that Ireland are talking about sending police to man that border, when of course we all remember, don't we, during Brexit, the no hard border, this is going to break apart international treaty, the Good Friday Agreement, there can't be spot checks on the border at all. It seems like they've forgotten what they used to fight us about a few years ago and are suddenly thinking that's a good idea now that the boot's on the other foot and the problem is all theirs.
Well, look, I mean, anything which establishes a hard border or a harder border between Northern Ireland and the Republic is really bad news, because the Good Friday Agreement was a tremendous achievement from John Major and Tony Blair subsequently, and it's held quite well. And the violence, the awful violence of the 1980s and 1990s has gone away, but it's fragile, and hard borders can re-establish that antagonism and that warfare almost between different groups. So yes, it is on the boots on the other foot this time round, and the British government has said that it's not going to take any lessons from Ireland until there's an agreement with the EU going the other way, which I think is an understandable position, but it's a very unfortunate situation to arise. I know that the position in Ireland is actually quite frenetic, because I've got friends in Cork who tell me that the population at large is deeply unhappy with how the Irish government's approaching this matter.
Oh, yeah, Norman, I think you're absolutely right. I was actually going to come on to that myself. Norman Baker, former Home Office Minister, thank you ever so much.